Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a lightning rundown of about 24 months of work that we've done at the agency. And before I get into all that, I think I just want to share a little bit about who I am, and you can all decide if you care what I have to say. I have spent the better part of 20 years in this industry, and I've tried to really cultivate a broad understanding of the data industry. So I've spent the majority of that time working for agencies, looking over teams that manage marketing insights and measurement, but I've also spent time on the client side understanding what it is to work with and buy agency services. I've also worked in the research supplier field, so I know all of the ins and outs of the product development side on the platform piece. So with that, I try to bring that kind of unified perspective. But I do want to talk mostly about my time at We Communications over the last 4 years and what we've learned. So if you know nothing about We Communications, this is just a quick primer. We were born in technology. More than 40 years ago, we helped with Microsoft's early storytelling, and we're very proud to still call them a client more than 40 years later. But we have been privileged to be participants and shapers of some of the biggest innovation storytelling moments of our time. And you can see some of them on here, helping Adobe, helping Microsoft, helping Intel and Palo Alto. There are many others. But I tell you all this not so much because you should care about We Communications, more because it is important to where we're going. We do so much innovation storytelling that we had to zoom out and just try to understand, do people care about innovation storytelling? Are we doing it right? And so we looked at some broad data. We like to zoom out to be able to zoom in. And it turns out, maybe surprise to nobody, that this is the golden age of innovation storytelling. You see a 6x increase in the growth of this topic in media over the last 2 years. And I think importantly, you don't see it living only in the tech sector. You see it breaking into every sector. Every company is a technology company. Every company has a story. And you'll notice I'm not saying AI. I'm saying innovation, because I think AI is a piece of it, but not the whole story. But when we look at all the data about news consumption, the data about changing behaviors amongst our readers, we have to wonder, why is engagement dropping? Why do we not see all this engagement around our innovation stories? We're telling so many of them, and yet we see 75% decrease in shares and comments. We see that as many as 4 out of the 10 people you maybe commuted with this morning are actively avoiding the news. And so we have to realize that it's not necessarily the innovation stories that are not interesting to people. I think we believe we're in this golden age. It's the way that we're telling those stories that are not breaking through, that are not doing the hard work that we need them to do. So when you look at what we, I think, kind of hilariously call alternative sources, everything that's not your sort of more established media, broadcast, digital print, you see exploding increases in innovation on, engagement on topics related to innovation across social, newsletters, podcasts. So what gives? And I think this frames it up, is that mass audiences want to hear from companies. They want to hear about innovation stories, but they don't like the way that we're telling them. So we had to sit back and kind of ask ourselves some questions about, all right, we're trying to tell these stories, but ultimately, how do we do it in the best way possible? And so I like this, which, oh, it is playing. It wasn't playing before. Good. This moment with the Bobs from Office Space, where I think we have to ask ourselves, and this is apropos given the last session, what is it that we think PR's job is? And I would argue that one of the main jobs is to make the news that we have the best possible version of itself. And by best, I mean make sure it travels, make sure it moves and endures and is consumed by the audiences. And that is not as simple as pitching a reporter or lining up a blog post on your website. That is a very complicated endeavor these days, because as we all know, You maybe try, oh, I just want to do a digital print story, and before you know it, it's a podcast or it's social media, and you've lost control. And this is the reality of how people consume information these days. I believe that there are a lot of bad models out there, but I think that, and I'm paraphrasing someone, that they're still useful. So this is an oversimplified model. I think generational insights are valuable, but I think, like many of the people in this room, I prefer insight, interest groups, and more specific segments. However, like I said, generational views can still be instructive. In this case, we see just an enormous difference between how Gen X and boomers prefer to consume news, what their sources are, and this is courtesy of Pew Research. But so what we kind of realized looking at the generational view is that at the high level, we need to meet 4 news behaviors. For Gen Z, we have to create content that is relatable. They want relatable content. They value authenticity. They value the journalists and creators who understand their place in life. Millennials want to investigate. I'm a millennial. I like a deep story. I want to go and control how much detail is available to me. Gen X is all about discovery. They value open-mindedness, curiosity about the wider world, and boomers are often in a place of validation. And this was meant to be the reveal, but you know. So we take all this information that we have, and what we kind of realized as a group at the agency is that the answer for how to manage all of this was maybe sitting under our nose, sitting in really just a data visualization. So what we believe, and maybe this isn't groundbreaking, is that today's content, today's stories travel through this interdependent ecosystem of channels. And that ultimately, if you pick one channel, you just try to reach Gen Z, you just try to reach Gen X, or you just pitch digital news, you are weakening the impact and longevity of what is possible. So what we set out and kind of stumbled into was this idea of an influence swell, which is a model of thinking about how to choreograph and plan a motion, plan a storytelling motion in a way that takes into account the full gamut of the ways that information travels today. And if you break it down really, the swell comes in 3 sections. It starts with a moment of ignition, a moment of often building on existing social provocation, existing conversations perhaps in Reddit or sub communities online. And then it moves into a place of sometimes an embargo lift, sometimes a real news moment happens, and then you have a swell of interest, a swell of social discussion. You often then see that if it's big enough, broadcasts will begin to cover it. Naturally, broadcast needs time to pull together the segments, to get the interviews lined up and everything, so that could happen into the next day. And then when it's done well, you see that it doesn't just fall off, and there's cultural commentary, and that there's long-form response to news as people realize that this is maybe changing the way that I'm gonna live or changing the way that I'm gonna work. This is the shape of what we believe is a strong story. What we so often see in this industry, though, is a spike. You know, you're able to break the news in the moment, and then by the time you have more storytelling that you want to do, you've already moved on, the world has moved on. So what we are trying to preach and to work with our clients on is being very purposeful in building the swell. I mentioned we work with Microsoft quite a bit. Last year, some of you may know, it was a big news moment, but Microsoft had a very scientific storytelling moment. They had reached a scientific breakthrough around quantum computing. They released a new kind of quantum chip called Majorana 1. And what we did very purposefully was we took our swell model, and this is in advance of any of the actual storytelling motions. We laid out the desired choreography. We laid out the sequencing of who are the igniters for this moment. When do we want to bring things into a place of sustaining? And then how are we going to make sure that this story doesn't just go away overnight, that we extend it? And naturally, Microsoft's motions are often global. So we wanted to think about not just the news landing in the US, where Microsoft is headquartered, but also how does this translate into global markets? How does this move and evolve? And so this is kind of, and that was the plan, and what you see here is the result. So you can see it doesn't exactly match the sort of archetypical swell that I showed, but it does demonstrate that if you can sequence things properly, that they kind of will combine and accumulate into something larger and into something that lasts more over time. I mentioned that we talk about igniters, we talk about extenders. This is a really valuable exercise. If you're in the middle of planning a news moment, consider this framing. Consider picking, and again, it could be through embargo lift, through finding those high reach, high authority earned media sources, but also consider creators who might have a ground truth that they can share. Also consider executives or internal voices who might be able to generate excitement or interest right at the moment of launch. And then, as much as you can, plan out your extension. Don't wait until the news has already happened. Already have a plan for 24 hours, for 48 hours, for 72 hours. Line up interviews, line up podcasts. There's a great opportunity to go a lot deeper that can't really be done right at the moment of launch, but is a great thing to do 2 days later to go deeper and potentially to really tell the story for that millennial audience that loves that investigative approach. And what we also found is that the extenders will show up. If you tell your story right, not all of these were planned. Some of them were through pickup. We learned a couple other things specifically. And this was interesting because there's always this push and pull of like, okay, am I going to overcorrect and just go with creators or just go with podcasts? But what I've said, for the last few minutes here is that it's really about any one channel alone is weak. What you want to do is think about the interaction and the crossover. So with that in mind, we wondered, what is the social conversation and what is the crossover from earned media? What is the impact? And what we found is that in the first few hours after this launch, 1 in 6 social posts were people resharing an article. That may not be that surprising, but if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If I am excited about reading some news or about seeing something, I won't just want to post on social, hey, I read this thing. I want to link to the thing. I want to have something that is authoritative that proves out what I'm saying. So, but what we found is that was a much more effective strategy for driving a social swell of interest than purely through creators or purely through brand posting. So earned media, as much as we know it sort of lives in its own place, it is not confined to its origin. It does travel. Broadcast is also interesting because I think some people are very quick to throw out broadcast, but it is a crucial vehicle for driving translation and for elevating conversation about something, especially after the first 24 hours. It was a crucial role for making sure that this very scientific story was told in a way that was understood by around the kitchen table and in homes far and wide. So like I said, it's very useful to think about your voices and to think about the different stages of your storytelling. There's the igniting, the breaking of the news, there's your ground truth, and then there's the insider insight, which goes a lot deeper. So, leaving you with some thoughts. 6 steps to scale influence using the Swell model and some of our learnings over time. 1, and AMEC is the perfect place and has all the right resources to do this, but define your goals, lay out very clearly what is it that you intend to accomplish, how do you intend to measure those things, and be very specific. 2, identify your audience and be more specific than generations. Really focus on what do you know, what are their content behaviors, what are their interests, and build from there. 3, Make sure that you're placing everything in cultural context. What you knew about that audience a week ago might be different today because of things that are breaking, because of things that are changing in their world. 4, identify your influence heroes. This is to say, who are the voices that can carry the weight of your story credibly, authentically, and that have the relationship with their audiences. 5, and this is really the meat of the Swell model, is make sure you're choreographing your story. Make sure you're thinking about what are your igniters, what are your swell moments, the places where you want to have the biggest conversation, and broaden those shoulders of that swell. Your goal is not to have the biggest news moment and a single spike. Your goal is to have a sustained wave of a model. And certainly don't, 6 is that it's the swell, although what I showed you is just one moment, view that as many swells happening over time and continue to engage so that you can have littler moments in between your big news moments, because we all know that that's one of the hardest things to do, is to make news when we don't have big news. And I think that's it.